My dad. 2 words. Barely a whisper. But they landed in that scorching August parking lot like a thunderclap that silenced 12 hardened men who had ridden through war zones, prison yards, and every dark corner this country had to offer, and not one of them had an answer for what they felt in that moment. If you've ever watched someone try to disappear while standing completely still, you know exactly what Cole Maddox saw when he looked at that girl. Welcome to our channel. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that parking lot, because what happened next changed everything. The August heat in Redwater, Montana does not ask permission. It presses down on everything: the asphalt, the rusted roof gutters of abandoned buildings, the back of your neck when you've been sitting outside too long with no shade and no water and no way to leave. It is the kind of heat that makes you feel like the world has forgotten you exist. And for Haley Monroe, 20 years old, sitting alone on the cracked concrete outside a closed roadside diner with her knees pulled to her chest and a small brass key clenched so tightly in her fist that it left a mark in her palm, that feeling wasn't a metaphor. It was just Tuesday. She had been sitting there for 3 hours, maybe 4. She had stopped counting when the sun climbed high enough that there was no shadow left to follow. Her pale blue blouse had a tear along the left sleeve, near the shoulder, the kind of tear that doesn't happen from snagging on a fence. It happens from a hand grabbing and fabric not giving way fast enough. The bruises on her right wrist had gone from deep purple to that sickly greenish yellow that meant they were old enough to be fading, but recent enough that they still hurt when she moved her fingers. She didn't move her fingers much. 3 cars had slowed down. 2 trucks. 1 couple in a minivan with out-of-state plates had actually pulled in. And the woman, maybe 50, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, had gotten halfway out the passenger door before her husband said something low and sharp, and she got back in. Haley watched the minivan pull away without making eye contact with either of them, because she already knew what making eye contact meant. It meant explaining, and explaining meant questions, and questions meant someone eventually called her father, because in Redwater County, Dean Monroe knew everybody worth knowing, and everybody worth knowing owed him something. So Haley sat. She pressed her back against the cinder block wall of the closed diner, and she watched the highway, and she waited for something she couldn't name, because the alternative was accepting that there was nothing left to wait for. She had no phone. Dean had taken it 2 days ago, plucked it out of her hand like it was his to take, which in his mind it was, because he paid the bill, and things he paid for belonged to him. She had no wallet. He had taken that too, along with the small emergency cash she'd been saving in a zippered pocket of her duffel bag for 6 months. Folding up $5 bills like she was building something, which she was. He'd found it while she was in the shower and left the empty bag on her bed so she'd know he'd found it without him having to say a word. She had no identification. Her driver's license, her birth certificate, her social security card, all of it had been in a manila envelope in Dean's home office for 2 years, locked in the filing cabinet he kept behind his desk. The one with the combination only he knew. What she had was the key. It was small and old, the kind of key that opens a padlock rather than a door, with a number stamped on the bow in faded ink, 114. Her mother had pressed it into her hand 18 months ago, 3 weeks before. The cancer made pressing anything impossible, and she had said, "You keep this. Don't let your father see it. Don't tell anyone. And if the day ever comes when he tries to take the one thing I left you, you take that key, and you go to Harker's storage on Route 9, Unit 114, and you open that box." Her mother's hands had been cold already by then, and thin in a way that scared Haley deeply, but her grip had been iron. "Promise me," Haley had promised. She'd worn the key on a thin chain inside her shirt every day since. And when Dean had taken everything else 2 days ago, he hadn't thought to check her neck. That was his first mistake. She heard the motorcycles before she saw them. The sound came up from the south on the highway, low and rolling like a distant storm that had decided to turn in your direction. And it grew steadily until the first bike cleared the highway junction, and then they were coming in 12 of them, staggered in the practiced formation of people who ride together long enough that the movement becomes instinct. The chrome caught the afternoon sun. The engines were loud in that particular way that can either feel threatening or feel like a heartbeat, depending on who you are and what your life has been like. Haley's first instinct was the same one she developed over years of reading rooms and reading men. She made herself smaller. She pulled her knees closer. She kept her eyes down. She had learned early that certain kinds of male attention arrived with expectation attached, and the lesson had been taught harshly enough that she never forgot it. She heard the engines cut, one by one, and then the relative silence of the parking lot returned, broken by boots on asphalt and the low, easy conversation of men stretching after a long ride. She counted the sounds without looking up. She heard a cooler open. She heard the crack of someone rolling their neck. She heard a voice say something about the heat, and two other voices agree in the tone men use when they're not really talking, just making the sound of talking, because silence in a group feels strange. She did not look up. The boots she heard approaching slow, deliberate, not the stride of someone crossing a parking lot with purpose, but the walk of someone who didn't want to startle a person they'd already noticed, was frightened, stopped about 8 feet away. She still didn't look up. Hot day to be sitting on concrete. The voice was low, unhurried, not the voice of a man trying to be something. Just a voice. Haley said nothing. I've got a water. Hasn't been opened. You're welcome to it if you want. She looked up then, just briefly, the way you check the weather before deciding whether to believe the forecast. What she saw was a man in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, with a gray beard cut close and eyes that were doing something she wasn't used to. They were watching her face, not her body. He was holding a plastic water bottle at arm's length, not extended toward her, but held loosely, like an offering that could be withdrawn without insult if she said no. He'd taken his leather vest off and folded it over his arm. She noticed that detail without fully understanding it. Though she understood it later, he'd removed the thing that made him look like what he was, because he'd read the situation well enough to know that she needed the man before she could hear anything about the patch. I'm Cole, he said. We're just stopping through. Needed a stretch. Haley looked at the water bottle. Her throat had been dry for hours. Thank you, she said, and reached out slowly and took it. Cole Maddox did not sit down. He did not move closer. He turned slightly sideways so that he was no longer facing her directly, and looked out at the highway as though the view interested him, which gave her the freedom to look at him or not look at him as she chose. It was such a specific and practiced piece of human behavior that it would have felt calculated coming from anyone else. From Cole, it felt like something he'd learned the hard way, the kind of knowledge that comes from mistakes made and lessons absorbed. She drank half the bottle in one long pull. Behind Cole, she could see the other riders had distributed themselves around the parking lot without appearing to form a perimeter, though functionally, that's what they'd done. A few had their phones out. One was crouched beside his bike doing something with the engine. They were all aware of her, she could feel it, but none of them were looking at her. That was different too. Different from most of her experience. You waiting for someone? Cole asked. The question was simple. The answer was complicated. No, Haley said. Cole nodded like that was a complete answer, which it wasn't, and he seemed to understand that too. He didn't push. He stayed where he was, looking at the highway, letting the silence exist without treating it as a problem. A dark pickup came down the highway then, slowing at the junction, and Haley's entire body changed. It was subtle, her shoulders pulled up. Her breath shortened. She pressed harder into the wall behind her, but Cole noticed. She could tell he noticed, because his own posture shifted in response. Not toward her, but a degree or two toward the highway, the way a man stands when he's deciding whether something requires attention. The pickup kept going. It was not her father's truck. Her lungs started working again. You look scared just now, Cole said. Not accusatory, just observant. I'm fine. Didn't say you weren't. Another silence. A longer one this time, the kind that has weight. Haley looked down at the key in her hand. She'd been holding it so long, her palm had shaped itself around it. She thought about her mother, pressing it into her hands in that hospital room, the papery lightness of her fingers, the fierce certainty in her voice. Don't let him take the one thing I left you. Can I ask you something? Cole said. Haley looked up. Who hurt you? It was a direct question. Not dressed up, not buried in a longer speech, not softened into something that could be deflected. Just the question. 4 words that assumed she had an answer and trusted her to decide whether to share it. She had never been asked that before. Not like that. Not by someone who was already looking at her like the answer mattered more than the asking. Later, she would try to explain why she answered. She would say it was the heat, the exhaustion, the fact that she had nothing left to lose and nowhere left to hide it. She would say it was the water and the way he'd turned sideways so she could look away if she needed to. She would say it was the expression on his face, patient, and still, the face of a man who had learned that rushing people toward truth usually pushes them away from it. She would say a lot of things, but the real answer was simpler and more complicated at once. She answered because no one had ever asked her the question like they actually wanted to know. My dad, she said. And Cole Maddox, who had ridden through more hard country than most men will ever see, who had buried friends and stood in courtrooms and watched people at their absolute worst. And at something approaching Grace, Cole Maddox went still in a way that said everything without saying anything. Behind him, across the parking lot, the conversation stopped. Tell me, he said, and she did. Not all of it, not yet. She hadn't told all of it to anyone, because telling it required believing someone would listen. And that was a trust she'd been spending years learning she couldn't afford. But she told him enough. She told him about the documents Dean had put in front of her 2 days ago, the ones drawn up by his lawyer, the ones that would have given him permanent legal authority over the trust fund her mother had established before she died. She told him how she'd read those papers 3 times sitting at the kitchen table, her father across from her with a pen uncapped, and how she'd understood, maybe for the first time with full clarity, that every kindness he'd ever shown her had an invoice attached to it that was about to come due. She told him she'd said no. She told him about the way her father's face had changed when she said it. She told him about the truck ride that followed, Dean behind the wheel, his voice perfectly calm in the way that was worse than shouting, explaining to her, not arguing, not asking, explaining as though the conclusion were already settled, that she needed to think this through more carefully, and he was giving her time to do it. And when she was ready to be reasonable, she could call him. And he handed her phone and wallet and keys through the window and pulled away before she had time to ask how she was supposed to call anyone when he'd already taken the phone she was still reaching for. She had realized, watching his truck shrink in the distance, that he hadn't handed her anything. He'd thrown in the truck bed and left her to retrieve it herself. And by the time she'd climbed into the truck bed to look, the phone was gone. The wallet was gone. The keys were gone. There was nothing but road dust and the smell of diesel and the sound of his engine fading south. 3 hours, maybe 4. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting once. That was the thing she would remember most, not what he said in response, but the fact that he didn't say anything while she was talking, didn't offer explanations or ask clarifying questions or say things like, "Are you sure?" The way Deputy Pierce had said things like, "Are you sure?" The one time she'd tried to describe an argument with Dean to anyone official, 2 years ago, and Pierce had ended the conversation by calling her father to come and collect her. When she finished, Cole was quiet for a moment. Not an awkward quiet, a considering quiet. How old are you? 20. So a legal adult, yes. He looked out at the highway. He breathed. He said, "You're 20 years old. He doesn't own you, and you don't have to go back." She felt the words land somewhere in her chest, in the place where things that are true sometimes hurt more than things that aren't, because truth requires you to do something with it. "He'll say I'm unstable," she said. "He's been saying it for 2 years. People believe him. Some people believe what they're told. Cole said. That changes when there's evidence. I don't have any. He looked at her then. Not at the bruises, not at the torn sleeve, not at anything visible. At her face. You've got that key, he said. She looked down. She'd forgotten she was still holding it openly, had stopped hiding it without realizing when. My mom told me to use it, she said. If he ever tried to take what she left me. Sounds like that time is now. She opened her mouth to answer, and then she saw it coming up the access road from the highway junction, slowing before it even reached the lot, taking its time, the way things take their time when they're certain of where they're going and what they'll find there. Dark body, tinted windows, the sun visor folded down on the driver's side. Her father's brother's truck. She stood up so fast, the water bottle hit the ground. Hey, Cole's voice was still steady. Don't run, that's Russell. My uncle. If he gets to me before, nobody's getting to you. Cole turned toward the lot without raising his voice. And the change in him was not from calm to something hostile, but from still to present. The way a thing that has been waiting becomes a thing that is ready. Travis, he said, just the name. Normal volume. And from across the lot, the tallest of the riders looked up and walked over in the easy way of a man who doesn't need to run to arrive somewhere with authority. 3 others drifted in the same direction without being asked. Haley watched it happen and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt someone moving toward her problem instead of away from it. Russell Monroe parked his truck at the edge of the lot, stepped out, and surveyed the scene with the particular calibrated expression of a man assessing what story he'd need to tell. He was 44, broad like his brother, but run to softness, wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled down despite the heat, which was the kind of detail Haley had learned to notice. People who dress carefully in hot weather are usually careful about other things too. The kind of careful that's really just control with better manners. Haley. His voice came out warm and worried. Oh, sweetheart, your dad has been beside himself. Come on, let's get you home. She's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go, Cole said. Russell's eyes moved to Cole and then to the cluster of riders behind him, and then back to Cole. He recalculated visibly. I don't know who you are, sir, but this is a family situation and Haley has some. He paused. What the practice care of someone choosing a word difficulties. She gets confused sometimes. Stops her medication, and then things get complicated. This is really between family. She's 20 years old, Cole said. She's a legal adult. She's not required to go with you. I understand that. I do, Russell said. And his voice shifted to a register of tolerant patience that made Haley's stomach turn because she'd heard that register her whole life, the voice men use when they've decided you're not capable of understanding the situation. And they're being very generous about explaining it to you. But her father has been worried sick, and there are some legal matters that need to be. She already told me about the legal matters, Cole said. That stopped Russell. His expression reset. She told you how long have you been talking to this man? Haley? Haley said nothing, but she didn't look away, and that was new. That was something she had to concentrate to do, and she concentrated. Whatever she said to you, she's not in a state to make decisions right now. Russell had abandoned warm and moved toward firm. I'd really appreciate it if you let me handle this. I've called the county sheriff, Cole said. They're on the way. We're happy to wait. That landed differently than everything else had. Russell's expression tightened at the corners in a way that was not quite anger, but was close enough to its cousin that Haley recognized the family resemblance. He looked at the riders again. More of them had drifted toward the center of the lot now, not aggressively but undeniably present, and he looked at Cole's phone in his hand, still recording, and he looked at Haley. This is not going to go well for you, he said, and she couldn't tell if it was aimed at Cole or at her, which was probably the point. Go back to your truck, Cole said. Stay where I can see you. When the deputy gets here, you can say whatever you want to say. Russell held the moment for 3 full seconds, Haley counted, and then he turned and walked back toward his truck, not quickly, which was its own kind of message. He took out his own phone. He was calling Dean. She was certain of it. Cole turned back to her. His expression was the same as it had been at the beginning, steady, unhurried, present. How long before your father can get here? He asked. She did the math. 40 minutes if he was already in town. Maybe 20 if he was out this way. Cole nodded. Deputy should be here in 15. Deputy Pierce is a friend of my dad's, she said. Cole didn't flinch. Okay. I have a friend who can help with that. He stepped away and made a call. She heard him say Renee, and then she stopped listening to the words and just listened to the tone of it, because the tone was the thing that told her what she needed to know. It was the voice of a man talking to someone he trusted completely, describing a problem they were going to solve together, and it had none of the weight of someone who wasn't sure the other person would come through. He came back in 3 minutes. My wife works with a domestic support center, he said. She's going to walk you through some things. She also has a contact with an advocacy organization that can have someone with you when you talk to the deputy. You don't have to do this alone. Why are you doing this? Haley asked. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Because you answered my question, he said. And because you've been sitting on that concrete for hours and nobody stopped. We stopped. She wanted to say something back, something that would be equal to what he just said. She couldn't find anything that qualified. Thank you, she said. Wasn't enough. Both of them knew it. Both of them let it stand anyway. Deputy Nolan Pierce pulled into the lot 11 minutes later in a county cruiser, stepped out with a slow ease that said he'd done this 100 times and expected it to resolve the same way each time. He was in his mid-40s, lean, with the particular kind of sunburn that comes from a lifetime of working outside in a state where the sun doesn't apologize. He took in the bikers, the 2 trucks, and Haley, and he walked toward Haley directly, which told her immediately what kind of conversation this was going to be. Haley Monroe, he said. Not a greeting, a confirmation. Deputy Pierce, she said, you're giving your family quite a scare. His eyes moved briefly to Cole and then back to her in a way that acknowledged Cole's presence and simultaneously ranked it. How about we get you sorted and head home? She hasn't done anything wrong, Cole said. Pierce's attention moved to him fully. And you are? Cole Maddox. Cole extended his hand in a way that was both polite and unmistakable. He was not going to be made small in this conversation. We found her here a couple hours ago. She indicated she'd been left here by her father. She's 20 years old and a legal adult, and she's been reporting injuries. Haley has a history of... I know about the history, Cole said. I also know that she'd like to give a formal statement, and she'd like an advocate present when she does it. My wife has arranged for one. Should be here within the hour. Pierce's face did not change dramatically, but his next word came a half beat slower, which is where you find the things people are deciding not to say. That's not really necessary. She thinks it is. She's a legal adult. So it is. Something moved across Pierce's face that Haley had seen on her father's face, not quite anger, not quite frustration, something older and simpler than either of those things. The expression of someone who expects the ground to be solid and has found it moving. He looked at Haley. That what you want? The question was designed to sound like he was giving her a choice. She heard the design of it clearly, because she'd had 20 years of practice listening for it. Yes, she said. I want to give a formal statement, and I want my advocate here first. Russell had climbed out of his truck at some point and drifted to within earshot. She could feel him there without looking. Pierce looked at his watch. He looked at the riders. He looked at Cole. He said, "We'll wait." And in the parking lot of a closed diner on a highway that the rest of the world was driving past without stopping, Haley Monroe did something she had spent 20 years forgetting how to do. She held her ground. The key was still in her hand. Her mother's voice was still in her head. Dean Monroe was somewhere on a highway moving toward her at a speed she couldn't control. And his lawyer was probably already awake. And Russell was probably saying things to Pierce that she couldn't hear. And the sun was still pressing down on everything without apology. But 12 riders were in that parking lot, and Cole Maddox was standing between her and every direction she was afraid of. And the first thing she'd said that was fully and completely true in longer than she could remember was still hanging in the August air, light and irreversible. My dad, too. And they had changed the shape of the afternoon. They had changed the shape of something larger than that. Though she didn't know it yet, couldn't know it yet, standing there in the heat with a bruised wrist and a brass key and a deputy who didn't want to help her and an uncle who was already building the story he'd tell about this day. What she knew was simpler and more immediate. She was still here. She hadn't run. She hadn't taken back the truth. For the first time in years, she had nowhere left to fall. That wasn't her own choice. And that, it turned out, was enough to stand on. The advocate's name was Sandra Okafor, and she arrived in a gray sedan 43 minutes after Cole made the call, which was fast enough that Haley understood. Renee Maddox had made the kind of phone call that doesn't get sent to voicemail. Sandra was a compact woman in her mid-40s with reading glasses on a lanyard and a canvas tote bag that looked like it carried the kind of organized weight that meant she had done this before many times, in many parking lots, in many situations where the person she was coming to help had already been told by someone official that they didn't need the kind of help Sandra provided. She walked straight to Haley without looking at Pierce first, which was another thing Haley noticed without fully naming, though she felt the significance of it. Pierce was the authority in the lot. Sandra had decided Haley was the person who mattered most. "You're Haley," she said. Not a question. She extended her hand. "I'm Sandra. Renee called me. You don't have to do anything today that you don't want to do, and you don't have to talk to anyone without me in the room. Okay?" Haley shook her hand and said, "Okay," and something in her chest, something that had been pulled taut since the moment Dean's truck disappeared down that road, released one careful degree. Russell Monroe was watching from the hood of his truck, arms folded, with the studied patience of a man who believed the situation was still controllable. Pierce had stepped away to make a phone call of his own, and Haley didn't need to guess who he was calling. The other riders had spread out across the lot in the casual way of men who had nothing urgent to do, which meant they were watching everything without appearing to watch anything, and that discipline was not accidental. Cole stood close enough to be present, far enough to give her room. He had put his vest back on, and for the first time she looked at it directly, the patch, the name, the insignia that she'd been taught by years of casual cultural shorthand to associate with danger and chaos and lawlessness. What she was finding, standing in that parking lot, was that the reality of the man wearing it was more complicated and more human than any shorthand accounted for. He caught her looking and said nothing. He just looked back in that even unhurried way of his, and she turned back to Sandra. "He's going to say I'm unstable," she told Sandra. "My father, he's been building that story for 2 years." "I know," Sandra said. "And I need you to understand something about that. That story only works in the dark. The moment you start talking to the right people, with documentation, with a medical examination, that story gets expensive to maintain." "He has money, he does," Sandra said. "And money buys influence in a county this size. But it doesn't buy forensic evidence. It doesn't buy away physical documentation of injury patterns. And it doesn't buy away the things your mother left for you. If what Cole told Renee is accurate." Haley's hand closed around the key again. The habit was automatic by now. She was doing it until Sandra's eyes dropped to her hand and then came back up to her face without comment. "Will you let us get you a medical examination?" Sandra asked. "Tonight. At a clinic separate from anything connected to your father. He knows people at the county medical center. I know. That's why I have a contact at a clinic in Byers that's 40 minutes east. They have a physician who works with our organization specifically for situations like this." "Situations like this," Haley repeated. "Yes." Sandra said it without softening it, without hedging, without the particular kind of sympathetic vagueness that people sometimes use when they don't want to name the thing directly. Situations where a family member has used financial and physical control over another family member for a sustained period of time. Situations where the person being controlled has been isolated, has had their documentation confiscated, has been told the world will not believe them. She paused. "You are not the first person I've stood in a parking lot with. Haley, you are not unusual, and you are not crazy." Something cracked open a little in Haley's chest when Sandra said that last sentence. She hadn't expected it to hit her the way it did. She'd heard the word crazy used as a deflection so many times, heard it in her father's measured voice, heard it in the tone of the people Dean had convinced over the years, heard it in Pierce's unspoken assumption when he'd looked at her and said, "You're giving your family quite a scare," that she'd started to treat it like weather, something she just had to move through. Hearing the opposite stated plainly, without drama, by a woman who had no particular reason to say it unless she meant it, that was something she had to breathe around. "Okay," she said, "I'll do the examination." Sandra nodded and turned toward Pierce, and the conversation she had with him was brief and professional and non-negotiable in tone. Haley watched Pierce's face during it. He didn't like it. He didn't say he didn't like it, which meant he'd done the calculation of what it would cost him to object and found the number too high. He took Sandra's card. He agreed that Haley could provide a formal statement at the Advocate Center's affiliated office rather than at the county station. He agreed that the examination would happen first. What he did not do was look at Haley with anything that resembled concern for her. He was closing a file in his head. She understood. He was managing a situation that had become more complicated than he'd been told it would be, and he was recalculating. And the thing that made her stomach tighten was that she could see him doing the math of what Dean would say when he called back, because Dean was going to call back, and Pierce was going to have to explain why he hadn't simply loaded her into the cruiser and driven her home and closed the chapter. Cole appeared at her left shoulder, close enough to lower his voice. "Your father just passed the junction," he said. "One of my guys clocked the truck. He's going to be here in about 4 minutes." Haley's pulse jumped. She felt it in her temples. Every trained reflex she had, the ones built over years of understanding that her father's arrival meant the shape of the room changed, pulled toward contraction, toward making herself small and quiet and uncomplicated. She pushed back against it. She breathed. She said, "Okay, you don't have to talk to him," Cole said. "You don't have to look at him. Sandra's going to be right beside you, and we're right here. Just stay where you are." "He'll know how to play this," she said. "He's good at it." "I know," Cole said, "but he's playing to an audience that's changed." Dean Monroe's truck came down the access road at a speed that was controlled enough to be legitimate and fast enough to communicate urgency, which was exactly the calibration of a man who had thought about how to arrive at a scene like this in the 40 minutes it had taken him to get here. He parked with intention, stepped out with his phone in his hand, and his expression, set to something she recognized, the controlled distress of a worried parent, which was not a feeling but a performance. And he wore it the way certain men wear the right kind of watch, completely naturally, because they'd been wearing it long enough that it stopped feeling like a choice. He was 51 years old, tall, with the kind of sun-weathered physicality that men in towing and recovery develop from years of actual physical work. His hair was silver at the temples, and he wore it well, and he dressed in the way of a man who had anticipated needing to look trustworthy. Dark pants, a collared shirt, work boots that said, "I'm a practical man," without saying, "I'm a man who doesn't care about appearances." He scanned the lot once. Quickly the riders, Pierce, Sandra, Russell, and then his eyes found Haley, and his expression changed to something she had only ever seen him direct at other people. The kind of concern that looked genuine because it was built on a foundation of practice. "Haley." He moved toward her. "Mr. Monroe." Sandra stepped into the space between them without appearing to block him. It looked almost accidental, the way she moved. It wasn't. "I'm Sandra Okafor. I'm an advocate with the Family Protection Center. I'm here with your daughter." Dean stopped. He looked at Sandra with the patience of a man adjusting to an unexpected variable. "I appreciate you being here," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who appreciated nothing about it. "But I'm her father, and Haley has some medical history that makes these situations." "I've been briefed," Sandra said. "I'd ask that you give us a few minutes. She's my daughter." The warmth dropped one register. "I've been worried about her all afternoon. If you could just—" "She's 20 years old," Sandra said, "and she's asked for advocacy support. This is a standard process, and I'm sure you understand it. I'd appreciate your patience." Cole hadn't moved. He was standing to Haley's right, slightly back, his arms at his sides, not posturing, just there. His presence in the lot was something Dean had to work around, and Haley could see her father working around it, recalculating, absorbing, assigning. Dean was good at reading rooms and understanding power. He looked at Cole and understood immediately that this was not a man who could be talked down to or passed, and he filed that information away with the efficiency of someone who collected it for later use. "Haley," Dean said, and now his voice went soft in the specific way that had always worked on her, the way that said, "I'm not angry, I'm worried." Because worried fathers get empathy, and angry fathers get scrutiny, and Dean Monroe had never confused the two. "Honey, you know you can come home. Whatever happened earlier, we can talk about it. We can figure it out. You don't need all of this." She felt the pull of it. That was the thing she'd never been able to explain to anyone, not to the one friend she'd had in high school, before Dean found reasons to limit those visits, not to the therapist she'd seen twice. Before Dean found that appointment on the calendar and arrived at the office to discuss Haley's treatment with the therapist directly, which had ended the treatment. The pull wasn't toward the man. It was toward the version of things the man represented, the version where the conflict resolved, the version where she was wrong and he was worried, and going home meant the problem went away. The pull was toward the absence of this moment, which was hard and uncertain and required her to hold herself up with no practice in doing it. She looked at her father for a long moment. "You left me here," she said. Something moved across his face so fast she almost missed it. Not guilt. Not exactly. The expression of a man recalibrating what she was, what she'd become in the 4 hours since he'd driven away. "Haley, I gave you time to. You took my phone and my wallet and my ID and you drove away," she said. "You left me here with nothing. That is not—" He stopped. He looked at Pierce, then at Sandra, then at the riders. The audience he'd walked into was more complicated than Miracle phone call had prepared him for, and she could see him understanding that every word was being measured. "I gave you space to think. You've been under a lot of stress, and you thought I'd sign the papers." The lot went quiet in a way that parking lots rarely go quiet. Not silent. There was still highway noise, still the distant sound of wind, but the particular quiet of a group of people collectively holding breath. Dean's expression went through three things very quickly and settled on controlled grievance, which was his most sophisticated mode, because it looked the most like genuine emotion. "This is what I was telling Nolan about," he said, and his voice took on the tone of reluctant parental candor. "When she gets like this, she says things that, Haley, honey, you're not well right now. You know that. This is exactly the kind of situation we were trying to avoid." "What medication?" Sandra asked. Dean looked at her. "You mentioned to Deputy Pierce that Haley had stopped taking medication. I'd like to know what medication. She has anxiety, and when she stops her." "What medication, specifically?" Sandra's voice was pleasant and completely immovable. "Name, dosage, prescribing physician." Dean opened his mouth, closed it. In that gap brief, barely visible, the kind of pause that most people would miss, Haley saw it. The calculation, the reaching for something that should have been automatic, and finding it wasn't quite within reach. "Her primary care doctor handles all of that," he said. "Who is her primary care doctor?" "That's private medical information." "She's asking," Sandra said. "Haley, do you have a primary care doctor?" "No," Haley said. "He stopped taking me to appointments after my mother died. He said I was fine." Sandra didn't react dramatically. She just wrote something in a small notebook she'd produced from her bag. And that small motion, that quiet, ordinary act of documentation, landed in the parking lot with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to its size. Because writing something down says this is now part of a record. And a record means that what happens next has a before. Dean felt the weight of it. She could see it in the fraction of stillness that came over him, something ancient and instinctive, recognizing that the shape of the situation had changed while he was still constructing his first response to what it had been. "You're being manipulated," he said, and now his voice was quieter, directed at Haley only. trying to shrink the conversation back to just the two of them. These people don't know you. They don't know our family or what you've been through. I've been carrying this family since your mother died, and you know that. You know everything I've done. I know, she said. And she did. That was the complicated part she knew. She'd watched him work, watched him grieve, or perform grief, had spent 18 months unsure of the difference. Had spent longer than that unsure whether her own read on things was accurate or distorted, because that was what happened when someone spent years telling you your perception was the problem. I know what you've done, she said. And Mom did too. His expression went somewhere she'd never seen it go before. Something pulled back behind his eyes, very fast, like a door closing. She left you a letter, Haley said. She left me a lot of things. I know where they are. And Dean Monroe, who had spent 20 years being the most competent man in every room he entered, who had built a business and a reputation, and a carefully maintained story about a difficult daughter who needed guidance she was too confused to appreciate. Dean Monroe looked at her with an expression she could not fully categorize because she had never seen fear on her father's face before. It was only there for a second. Then it was gone, replaced by something smooth and composed, the practiced neutrality of a man deciding how to manage what he'd just heard. But she'd seen it. And more importantly, Cole had seen it, and Sandra had seen it, and Pierce, who was standing close enough, had either seen it or had been in close enough proximity that he'd felt the shift in the air the way you feel weather changing before it arrives. I think, Sandra said calmly, into the new silence, that we should continue this at the Advocacy Center. Mr. Monroe, Deputy Pierce, thank you for your time. She put her hand lightly on Haley's arm, not gripping, not directing, just present. Haley, do you want to come with me? Yes, Haley said. She walked with Sandra toward the gray sedan. She did not look back at her father. She felt his eyes on her the entire way, not the eyes of a worried parent watching his daughter get into a stranger's car, but something older and more calculating, the eyes of a man watching something he thought he owned walking away from him. Cole fell into step beside her for the last few feet, and at the car door he stopped. We'll follow, he said. You won't be alone at the clinic. You don't have to do that. He looked at her with that steady expression. We stopped, he said. That means we see it through. The examination at the clinic in Byers took 2 hours and 20 minutes. The physician was a woman named Dr. Asha Chand, quiet and methodical, understood and precise in the way of someone who understood that her findings would be scrutinized. She photographed the bruises on Haley's wrist. She documented 3 other areas of older bruising on her upper arm and left shoulder. She noted the pattern, different stages of healing, different time periods, and she used the word pattern in the way that medical people use it when they mean something specific and significant. Pattern means it wasn't once. Pattern means it was a practice. Haley sat on the examination table and answered questions and tried not to feel like she was dismantling something by answering them. That was the strangest part, the sense that telling the truth about her own life felt like destruction rather than construction, because she had spent so long understanding her life through her father's framing that stepping out it felt not like freedom but like falling. Dr. Chand asked her gently about the wrist, about when it had happened, about the circumstances. Haley told her about the papers, the pen, the table. The moment Dean's hand had come down on her wrist when she stood up, he didn't mean to, she started. Dr. Chand stopped writing and looked at her. He grabbed my wrist when I tried to leave the table, Haley said. Correctly this time, I pulled back. That's how it happened. Thank you, doctor, Chand said, and wrote it down. Sandra sat in the corner of the examination room, not speaking during the medical portion, just there. Presence as protection. Haley understood in that room what the advocacy work actually was: not fighting, not loudness, not confrontation, just the body of someone who would not be moved, positioned between the person who needed protecting and the space where harm came from. When they left the clinic, the sun had gone down and the temperature had dropped to something approaching bearable. Cole was in the parking lot with 4 of his riders. The others had apparently stayed back in Redwater, though she'd find out later They hadn't been idle. "How'd it go?" he asked. Sandra answered. "Good, documentation is solid. We have a meeting tomorrow morning with an investigator from the state family court office who isn't connected to the county network." She paused. "And I need to tell you both something." They looked at her. Dean Monroe filed an emergency petition with the county court at 4:47 this afternoon, she said. He's requesting that Haley be declared mentally incompetent and that he be appointed her legal guardian. Haley's legs went unsteady for just a moment. She put her hand on the car door without meaning to, steadying herself. "He filed it this afternoon," she said, "while I was still sitting in the parking lot." "Yes." Sandra said it straight. He had it prepared. The paperwork was ready. His attorney submitted it within 2 hours of you leaving the house. The words resettled themselves into a shape. Haley could understand the shape of something that had been planned, something that had been waiting for either her signature or her refusal. And her refusal had simply triggered a different mechanism in a machine that had been built before she understood it existed. "If the petition goes through," Sandra said, "he would have legal control over your financial decisions, your housing, your medical care. You would not be able to access your mother's trust independently." "Can he get it?" Cole asked. "He has a local attorney, a local judge he's donated to, and a deputy who'll write a report about a distressed young woman being influenced by motorcycle club members." Sandra's voice was matter-of-fact, not alarmist. "Without countervailing evidence, documented injury, financial irregularity, testimony, yes. It's possible." Cole looked at Haley. "The storage unit," he said. "Route 9. She said, "Unit 114. How long has it been since anyone was there?" "Since my mom put things in it. She died 18 months ago." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Then we go tomorrow. First thing. With the investigator and a witness. Dean will try to get there first if he knows about it," Haley said. "Does he know your mother kept a storage unit?" She thought about it. Her mother had been careful. The way dying people sometimes become careful not from weakness, but from a very clear understanding that there are things they need to arrange before they lose the ability to arrange them. She had paid the annual fee in cash from her personal account, separate from anything Dean managed. She had told no one but Haley. "I don't think so," she said. "Then we go at 6 in the morning," Cole said, "before he thinks to look." That night, Haley slept in the spare room of the Advocacy Center's connected safe house, a modest set of rooms above a community building that existed specifically for situations like hers, funded by people she'd never meet who decided that situations like hers were worth funding. Sandra had given her a toothbrush, a change of clothes, a glass of water. The room had a lock that Haley controlled. That detail, the lock she controlled, kept her awake for 20 minutes while she absorbed what it felt like. She kept the key under her pillow. Old habit, adapted. She lay in the dark and thought about her father's face in the parking lot, the half-second of fear, gone before it could be named. She thought about the petition filed at 4:47, prepared in advance, ready to be triggered. She thought about 2 years of monitored phone calls and confiscated wages, and the careful story built one neighborly gesture at a time, church vehicles, charity donations, the warm voice at the county fair, and she understood, for the first time, the full shape of it. Not cruelty from anger. Cruelty from planning, a structure built patiently, over years, designed to make sure that if she ever said no, the no wouldn't matter. He'd prepared for her refusal. He just hadn't prepared for 12 motorcycles. In the morning, her phone, a cheap prepaid Sandra had provided, buzzed at 5:15. She was already awake. Cole's message said, "Ready when you are. Coffee's hot." She thought about the fact that this man, who had not known her name 12 hours ago, had spent those 12 hours making sure she had a place to sleep and a door with a lock she controlled, and someone who would show up at 5:15 in the morning with coffee. She got up. She got dressed. She picked up the key. At the storage facility on Route 9, the unit numbers were stenciled on corrugated metal doors. And the morning was cold in the way that Montana August mornings can be cold before the sun remembers what month it is. The state investigator, a woman named Torres, from the family court office in Helena, who had driven 3 hours on Sandra's call, stood with them as Haley crouched in front of Unit 114 and fit the brass key into the padlock. It had been 18 months. The key was stiff. She worked it slowly, feeling the tumblers resist and then release. And when the lock opened with a click that was small and absolute, she stayed crouched for a second with her eyes closed. Her mother's hands, cold and thin and certain, "Promise me." She opened the door. Inside the box, her mother had left tucked in a waterproof case at the back of the unit. Behind a folded moving blanket were letters, bank statements printed, and folded over many months. Audio files on a small digital recorder, fully charged as though her mother had anticipated waiting. And copies of the trust documents, marked in her mother's handwriting, with specific line items circled in red pen and notations in the margin. Torres crouched beside her. She put on evidence gloves. She began, carefully and methodically, to look at what Laura Monroe had left behind. And in Redwater, 40 minutes west, Dean Monroe was on the phone with his attorney, his voice controlled and asking how quickly they could file an injunction to seal any evidence collected by an unauthorized party from private family storage. His attorney asked who had authorized the search. Haley Monroe, Dean said. The name came out like something he was trying to contain. The attorney was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's a legal adult. She has full authorization over anything in her own name or her late mother's estate." Dean hung up. The silence in the truck was the silence of a man who has just understood that the thing he thought he'd built is standing on ground he didn't account for, and the ground is moving, and there are people around it now who are writing things down. The records in that box were going to take a week to fully document. Torres told them that in the storage unit, her voice professionally level, her expression giving away nothing. But she also said one other thing. Quietly, while Haley held the last letter, the one addressed in her mother's handwriting directly to her, the one she hadn't opened yet because she was afraid of what it would do to her to read it standing in a cold storage unit with strangers watching. Torres looked at her and said, "Whatever's in that letter, your mother planned this. She built this for you. She knew what she was doing." Haley looked at the envelope, her name in her mother's careful cursive, the kind of handwriting that takes time, that says the writer decided every letter mattered. She folded it and put it in her pocket. She'd read it when she was ready, when she could give it what it deserved, but she carried it with her when she walked out of that unit into the thin Montana morning. And the key she'd kept for 18 months was no longer something she needed to hide. It had done what her mother sent it to do. The door was open now. And whatever came next, the attorney, the petition, her father's phone calls, Pierce's report, the machinery of a small county where Dean Monroe had spent 20 years building the right kind of credibility, whatever came next, she would not be walking into it with nothing. She had her mother's words. She had documented injuries. She had a state investigator standing beside her with evidence gloves and a case number. She had 12 riders who had stopped when no one else did. And she had something she hadn't had in the parking lot. Yesterday, the specific, irreversible knowledge of what her father's face looked like when he understood that she was not going to disappear back into the story he'd written for her. That was worth something. More than something. That was the first real piece of her life she'd taken back. Torres spent the first hour in the storage unit without speaking much. That was how Haley knew she was good at her job. The ones who talked too much in the early stage were usually filling silence because they were uncertain. And Torres was not uncertain. She moved through the contents of the waterproof case methodically, handling each document with gloved hands, holding certain pages up to the light that came through the open door, setting others in a separate stack with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that the order in which evidence is examined can matter as much as the evidence itself. Cole stood outside the unit door with his arms folded and said nothing. His presence there was both witness and guardrail. If anyone arrived who shouldn't, he would know before they reached the door. Two of his riders had positioned themselves at the facility entrance without being asked. The third was in the parking lot with a clear line of sight to the road. None of them had been instructed to do any of this. They had done it because they understood what the morning required. And that understanding, that fluid, practiced course coordination between men who trusted each other's read of a situation was something Haley watched and absorbed and would think about later. Sandra sat beside Haley on the cold concrete floor outside the unit and didn't say anything either, which was its own kind of gift. It was Torres who broke the silence, and when she did, her voice was level, but her eyes, when she looked up from the page she was holding, had something in them that was more than professional attention. "Ms. Monroe," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it as specifically as you can. Did you ever sign any financial documents related to your mother's trust at any point in the last 2 years?" "No," Haley said. "I refused." That was why she stopped, rerouted. That was why he left me at the diner. Torres turned the page she was holding so Haley could see it. It was a signature authorization form for the Monroe Family Trust. The date was 14 months ago. The signature line had Haley's name on it, written in a hand that looked to anyone who hadn't spent 20 years looking at their own handwriting plausibly like Haley Monroe's signature. "Is that your signature?" Torres asked. Haley looked at it for a long time. Her own name, written by someone else's hand, authorizing a transfer of $6,000 from the trust principal into an operating account registered to Monroe Recovery and Towing. "No," she said. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." She pointed at the loop in the capital M, the way it opened instead of closed, the way her mother had taught her to write it when she was 7, because her mother said open letters meant an open mind. "I don't make that letter that way. Whoever wrote that doesn't know that." Torres put the page back in the stack. She reached for the next one, and the next. And what built in the cold morning air of that storage unit, document by document, was something that felt at first like nausea, and then settled into something harder and more permanent, the specific shock of seeing, laid out in paper and ink, the actual architecture of a theft. Not one signature, 6 over 14 months, 6 separate authorizations, each one pulling money from the trust her mother had built across 22 years of careful, patient saving money from her teaching salary, money from a small inheritance her own mother had left her, money she had protected in a legal structure specifically because she understood, in the quiet way that sick people understand, things they can't say out loud, that her husband would find a way to access anything she left without that protection. 6 forged signatures. $43,000 redirected into the towing company. 43,000, Haley said quietly. "That's what these documents reflect," Torres said. "There may be more. The full audit would take time." Cole made a sound that was not a word, something low and controlled, and said nothing else. "There's one more thing," Torres said. She reached into the waterproof case and produced a small digital recorder, matte gray, the kind that costs $20 at any office supply store. This was in a separate sealed bag inside the case. "Do you know what's on it?" "My mother said she'd recorded things," Haley said. "I didn't ask what. She just told me the recorder would be in the box." Torres looked at the recorder. She looked at Haley. "I'm going to need this processed properly. Chain of custody. But I want you to know that we are going to listen to it, and whatever's on it is going to be part of the official record." Haley thought about her mother in the final months, thin, deliberate, moving through the house with the conserved precision of someone who couldn't afford to waste energy on anything that wasn't necessary. She had gone into that home office when Dean wasn't there. She had sat at the desk he thought of as his. She had made recordings on a $20 device and sealed them in a waterproof bag inside a padlocked storage unit on a highway that her husband didn't know existed. While she was dying, while she was in pain, while she was managing the logistics of her own ending. The scale of what her mother had done to protect her, not in a dramatic moment, not in a single act of courage, but in the long, exhausting, unglamorous work of preparation, of forethought, of loving someone with enough clarity to plan for the danger is coming, even when you can't stay to stop it. That scale settled on Haley's chest with a weight she could barely breathe around. She pressed her hand against her jacket pocket where the unread letter was folded. "Okay," she said, Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Torres sealed the recorder back in his bag and placed it in her case. She stood. I need to get this to the Helena office today. That's a 4-hour round trip. I want you to understand that once this documentation is in our system, it is no longer something that a county-level filing can suppress or redirect. She paused. Your father's attorney filed an injunction this morning to prevent evidence collection from this unit. The air in Haley's chest went somewhere else. He found out, Cole said. He filed preemptively, Torres said. He listed this facility's address in the filing. She looked at Haley, which means someone told him this unit existed. Cole straightened. Who knew about it? I didn't tell anyone, Haley said immediately. I know, Torres said. Neither did I, neither did Sandra, neither did Cole. She was quiet for a moment. The facility has a rental record. His attorney's office likely ran a search on your mother's name and financial history last night, looking for assets to include in the guardianship petition. This unit would have appeared in that search. So they know, Haley said. They know the unit exists. They don't know what's in it. And as of 45 minutes ago, neither the injunction nor anything else has legal authority collected by a state investigator in the course of an active inquiry. Torres picked up her case. The injunction is aimed at preventing you from accessing the unit. It names you specifically. It doesn't name me because they didn't know I was here. Cole looked at her. You moved fast. Sandra called me at 10 o'clock last night, Torres said, and I've seen what happens when these cases move slowly. She looked at Haley. The injunction was filed at 7 this morning. We got here at 6. That's not an accident. That's someone who paid attention and made a phone call. She looked at Cole when she said it. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to its shape. Torres left with the evidence case and her documentation and her professionalism, and the storage unit sat open and empty in the morning light, and Haley stood in front of it for a moment with the feeling of someone who has just watched something enormous happen in very quiet, ordinary motions. She planned it for you, Cole said from behind her. Your mom. From a long way out. She knew she was running out of time, Haley said. She didn't know exactly when. Just that she needed to get it done. That's love, he said. Not the easy kind. Haley closed the unit door. She held the padlock in her hand for a moment and then left it unlocked because there was nothing left inside worth protecting. That thought, that strange, bitter, liberating thought, sat with her all the way back to Redwater. By the time they reached the advocacy center, Dean had already been busy for 3 hours. Sandra met them at the door with her phone in her hand and an expression that said the news was incoming, and she'd already read it twice to understand it fully. She told them quickly. Dean's attorney had released a statement to the local paper about a vulnerable young woman being exploited by members of an outlaw motorcycle organization while experiencing a mental health episode. The statement named the Hells Angels specifically. It said that Haley had been manipulated into making accusations against her father while not in her right mind. It called for the community to support the Monroe family during a difficult time and asked concerned residents to contact Dean directly with any information about Haley's whereabouts. He had turned it into a missing person narrative. He had turned himself into the worried father and the riders into the threat. And he had done it before 8 in the morning, which meant he'd had the statement drafted before he went to bed, which meant this had not been improvised. Cole read the statement on Sandra's phone. He handed it back without changing expression. He wants us angry, he said. He wants us to do something that looks like what he's describing. I know, Sandra said. So we don't. He looked at his riders, 6 of them in the parking lot, the others presumably still in Redwater, doing whatever they decided to do in his absence. We document everything we do today, every interaction, every location. You pull over, you sit still, and you call me before you say a word to anyone who isn't us. He looked at Haley. He's going to come at you from a direction we're not looking, he said. That's what the statement is for, to make us look at him. So we stop looking at him and we look at everything else. Pierce, she said. Pierce is writing a report. That report is going to say things about yesterday that need countervailing witness statements. I've got 3 writers who were in that parking lot and watched the whole thing and can account for every word Pierce said and every word he didn't say. He paused. And I've been recording since I got there. You recorded Pierce? I recorded the parking lot. That includes Pierce. He said it without apology. Montana is a one-party consent state. Everything on that recording is legal. Sandra let out a breath. Send me a copy. Today. Already done, he said. Sent it to Renee this morning. She forwarded it to your legal contact in Helena. Haley watched this exchange, this methodical, unhurried, multi-front coordination between people who had known each other for years and trusted each other completely and felt something she hadn't anticipated feeling. Not gratitude, though that was there too. Something closer to understanding. This was what it looked like when people who were genuinely on your side operated. Not chaotic, not loud, not driven by anger. Precise. Deliberate. Moving on multiple tracks at once and never losing sight of the goal. Dean had spent years believing that his greatest advantage over Haley was that she was alone. He hadn't been wrong. He just hadn't anticipated the parking lot. The morning went the way that mornings in a crisis go fast in some places, inexplicably slow in others, full of phone calls and logistics and the specific emotional labor of holding yourself together while other people work. Sandra was in contact with the state family court liaison. Torres was driving to Helena with the evidence. Renee Maddox arrived at the center at 10 o'clock, a trim, composed woman in her late 40s with reading glasses and the calm certainty of someone who had spent years refusing to let difficult situations be anything other than problems with solutions. And she sat with Haley for an hour, and they talked, not about strategy, but about smaller things. What Haley had studied in high school before Dean decided she didn't need to finish. What she'd wanted to do, what she remembered about her mother that had nothing to do with the last year. Renee was not performing warmth. That was the thing. Some people who work in care become fluent in its performance because performance is sustainable in a way that genuine emotion isn't. And you can't burn out on a performance the way you burn out on actually feeling what the people in front of you are feeling. Renee hadn't chosen performance. She sat with Haley and she was actually present, and that presence, the simple, uncomplicated gift of a person choosing to be fully in a room with you, was something Haley absorbed without knowing quite how to account for it. You're going to have hard days, Renee told her. Even after this resolves, probably especially then. When the crisis is over and people stop calling and checking in and the adrenaline has nowhere to go, that's usually when it gets heaviest. I know, Haley said. Do you? Haley looked at her. I mean that genuinely, Renee said. Not as a test. I'm asking whether you have any experience of what it feels like when the fear stops and there's nothing left to run from. Because for some people, that's the hardest part. Haley thought about it. I've never had that. I don't know what that feels like. I know, Renee said. I'm telling you in advance so that when it comes, you recognize it for what it is. It's not weakness. It's your nervous system catching up. She paused. And when it comes, you can call me. You don't know me. I know enough, Renee said, and I'll know more. At 11:47, Cole's phone rang. He stepped outside and came back 3 minutes later with the expression of a man who has received information that requires him to think carefully before speaking. He sat down across from Haley and Sandra. Dean just filed an amended petition, he said. His attorney added a new claim. He's alleging that Haley was involved in accessing private financial documents that belonged to the Monroe family estate, that the storage unit belonged to the family, not to her mother personally, and that whatever was retrieved this morning was taken without authorization. That's not legally accurate, Sandra said immediately. No, Cole said, it's not. But the hearing is tomorrow morning, and the judge assigned is Mitchell Carver. A beat of silence. You know him? Haley asked. Dean Monroe sponsored the renovation of the Redwater Community Center 2 years ago, Cole said. Carver cut the ribbon. Haley felt the floor do something subtle under her. Not fall away, she had better footing than yesterday, but shift. The particular shift of understanding that the maze has more walls than you'd counted. Torres will have the evidence in Helena before end of business today, Sandra said. And her voice had the controlled quality of someone deciding what to believe. The state court has concurrent jurisdiction. We can petition to have the hearing moved. How long does that take? Longer than overnight. Cole looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Haley. There are 7 former employees of Monroe Recovery and Towing who have reached out to us this morning, he said. She stared at him. Word got around, he said simply. People talk. Especially when a story breaks that confirms things they'd been watching for a long time and didn't know they could say. He leaned forward slightly. 3 of them are willing to give statements about financial irregularities they witnessed. 2 others watched Dean Monroe sign documents using a name that wasn't his. And one of them, a dispatcher named Kay Briggs, who worked for Dean for 11 years, has a copy of an email Dean sent to a clinic administrator 6 months ago. What clinic? Sandra asked. The same that filed a supplementary report supporting Dean's claim that Haley was mentally incapable of managing her own affairs, Cole said. The same one that was supposed to be independent. The room shifted again, but this time it shifted differently, not the shift of a wall appearing, but the shift of a wall coming down. He paid them, Haley said. The email suggests an exchange, Cole said. It's not explicit enough to be a smoking gun alone. But combined with the forged signatures, the financial records, and the recorder, Torres thinks it's enough to support fraud charges. Does Dean know about the employees? Not yet. He will, Sandra said. Someone will tell him. Probably, Cole said. That's why we're filing the witness statements this afternoon, before his attorney can start making calls. He looked at Haley. I need you to understand what's happening right now. This is moving fast. By tonight, your father is going to know that the wall he built has more holes in it than he thought. And when that happens, people under pressure make decisions that are difficult to walk back. He's going to do something, she said. I think so. What? I don't know. But he's going to come at this from somewhere we're not expecting, because the places we're expecting are covered. Cole's voice was steady and unhurried, but underneath it was a precision that said he was thinking 3 moves ahead the way men think when the situation requires it, and they've been in enough situations to know what that requires. So whatever happens tonight, you stay in the center. You don't go anywhere without Sandra or Renee. You don't answer the door. And you don't answer any calls from any number you don't recognize. Okay, Haley said. I need you to really hear that. I hear it. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. He believed her. At 2 in the afternoon, Dean Monroe arrived outside the Advocacy Center with Deputy Pierce and 2 men. Haley didn't recognize, one of whom turned out to be a process server, there to deliver the amended petition, which was his legal right. The other turned out to be a local reporter from the county paper, who Dean had apparently invited to document what he was framing as his attempt to peacefully reach his daughter. Cole's riders were in the lot before the trucks fully stopped, not surrounding them, not blocking them, just present. A visible, quiet, numerically significant presence of people who had phones in their hands and hadn't done anything wrong. Sandra went out to receive the petition. She did it correctly, signed for it, thanked the server professionally, made no statement to the reporter. Pierce stood by Dean's truck and watched. And in the watching, there was the specific discomfort of a man who had walked into a situation expecting to be the most significant authority present and found that the calculation was more complicated than that. Dean looked at the center's door. He looked at the riders. He looked at the cameras. He was performing again. Haley could see it from the window, the controlled grief, the dignified posture, the expression of a man who has been failed by systems he trusted and is too well-mannered to say so out loud. He was performing for the reporter, for the camera, for the story that would appear in tomorrow's paper, and that he'd planned to have carry his version of events into the court record as community context. Then something happened that Dean had not planned for. Kay Briggs, the dispatcher, 11 years at Monroe Recovery, the woman with the email, pulled into the far end of the Advocacy Center lot in her own car. Having driven 30 miles from her home, having agreed 2 hours ago over the phone to give a formal statement, and having now arrived to do exactly that, with a printed copy of the email in a manila envelope under her arm. She walked across the lot towards Sandra. She passed within 20 feet of Dean Monroe. He saw her, and she saw him seeing her. And for a moment, just a moment, neither of them spoke, and the weight of 11 years, and what she knew, and what she was carrying in that envelope and where she was walking, all of it was visible in the space between them. Then Kay Briggs said, quietly, clearly, in a voice that was tired and decided and done, "I should have done this 2 years ago, Dean." And she kept walking. Dean's composure, the performance, the careful presentation of the grieving, patient, wronged father cracked, not dramatically, not in any way that would read clearly on a photo. But it cracked in the way that things crack when the weight has been building for longer than anyone on the outside could see. And the crack showed in his jaw, and in the flatness that came into his eyes, and in the half step forward he took before he stopped himself because the cameras were right there. Pierce put his hand on Dean's arm. A restraining gesture, small and quick, that said, "Not here." Dean stopped. He breathed. He rebuilt the expression. But Haley had seen the crack from the window, and Cole had seen it from the lot. And the reporter, whose instincts were apparently better than Dean had counted on, had seen it too. And the she was holding had been pointing in exactly the right direction. Inside the building, Sandra received Kay Briggs and took her directly to the room where the formal statement would be given. And the door closed, and the work began. And outside, Dean Monroe got back in his truck, and Pierce got in his cruiser, and the reporter stood in the lot for another full minute, looking at the building, and then at her camera, and then at the riders still standing quietly in the afternoon sun. And she did not immediately follow Dean, which was a decision that would shape the story she filed by morning in ways that Dean had specifically not anticipated. That evening, Cole sat outside the center on the hood of one of the bikes, and Haley came and sat beside him because sitting inside waiting had become the thing she was least capable of. He didn't tell her to go back in. He just moved over slightly and made room. They sat without talking for a while. The sun was going down again. It had only been 36 hours since she'd been sitting in a parking lot that felt like the end of something, holding a key she'd worn hidden for 18 months, watching cars drive past without slowing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah, when you saw me there at the diner. Before you said anything, what did you think?" Cole was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet. "I thought about my daughter," he said. "She's 23. She went through something a few years back, different situation, but something. And there was a time when she was sitting in a hard place and I wasn't there." He looked out at the road. "I couldn't do anything about that, but I could do something about you." Haley absorbed that. "I'm sorry. About your daughter." "She's okay now," he said. "Did the work. Came out the other side." He paused. "That's what I wanted you to understand when you asked why we stopped. It wasn't because we're good Samaritans. It wasn't because of the patch or the code or any of the things people write about us. It was because I saw someone sitting alone on concrete who shouldn't have been alone." "That's it. That's everything," Haley said. He looked at her sideways. "Yeah," he said, "maybe it is." At 9:17 that evening, Torres called Sandra from Helena. The state family court had agreed to assign a co-jurisdiction reviewer to the guardianship hearing, which meant that Judge Carver would not be ruling alone. The audio recordings from the digital recorder had been previewed by the Helena office, and what Laura Monroe had documented in those recordings was enough to open a formal fraud investigation into Dean Monroe and Monroe Recovery and Towing, independent of anything happening at the county level. Sandra came to find Haley with the phone still warm in her hand, and she told her, and Haley sat with it. "He's going to be arrested?" she asked. "That's not guaranteed," Sandra said. "Not yet. The investigation has to run. But he is no longer the only person telling a story about your family. And the story your mother built, the one in that box, is now in the hands of people he can't reach." Haley thought about the recording. Her mother sitting at Dean's desk while Dean wasn't home, holding a $20 device, speaking into it in whatever voice she had left at the end, saying what she'd seen, what she knew, what she needed someone else to hear when she was no longer there to say it. She knew, Haley said. She knew, Sandra agreed. Haley reached into her jacket pocket and took out the letter. Still folded, still unread. She looked at her own name in her mother's handwriting for a long moment. The open M, the careful letters of someone who decided each one mattered. Then she unfolded it and she read. She read it twice. There in the room, with the door closed, Sandra quiet in the corner, and the night outside's the window, and the distant sound of motorcycles turning over somewhere in the lot, riders changing shift, staying through the night, because Cole had said they'd see it through, and Cole meant what he said. She read every word her mother had written in that clear, deliberate, fierce hand. She read the part that said, I know what you've been living with, and I know you've been told it isn't real. And I need you to know that I saw it, all of it, and I am so sorry I couldn't stop it while I was still here. She read the part that said the trust is yours, every dollar, built for you, across 20 years, because I wanted you to have a beginning that was truly yours whenever you were ready for it. She read the part that said, if your father tells the world you are weak, remember that he needs them to believe it because your strength threatens him. She read the last line, which was not advice and not instruction, but just 4 words in her mother's handwriting. I believe in you. Haley sat with that for a long time. The letter on her knee, the room quiet. The key no longer needed as a key still in her pocket, kept now for different reasons. She had come into this situation with nothing but a small piece of metal and 2 words of truth. She had said those 2 words to a stranger in a parking lot, and the stranger had stopped. And the stopping had pulled on a thread that had turned out to be connected to a structure her mother had spent the last months of her life building in the quiet, in the hard patience of love that knows it won't be there to see what it built. Tomorrow, there would be a hearing. Tomorrow, Dean would walk into a room where the story he had told for 2 years was going to meet the story that Torres and Sandra and Kay Briggs and 7 former employees and the Helena family court office had built in 36 hours. Tomorrow, Pierce would write his report, and the world would have to decide what it believed. But tonight, Haley Monroe had her mother's letter in her hands, and the truth on the record, and 12 riders in the parking lot who had stopped when the rest of the world hadn't, and the specific, irreversible knowledge that the bravest thing she had ever done was also the simplest. She had told the truth to someone who asked, and the truth, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly that. She didn't sleep much, not because she was afraid, not exactly, but because the body, after years of learning to stay alert, doesn't simply stand down because the situation asks it to. Haley lay in the safe house room with her mother's letter folded on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling and listened to the building breathe and tried to locate the feeling she thought she was supposed to have. Relief, maybe, certainty. The clean, clear sensation of a door opening. What she found instead was something more complicated and less photogenic, a kind of hollow exhaustion that sat behind her sternum like a stone. Not painful exactly, just heavy. The weight of everything that had been held in place by tension finally having nowhere to press against. The letter was there. The evidence was in Helena. The hearing was in 7 hours. Her father was somewhere in Redwater in a house she had grown up in, and she had no idea what he was doing. And not knowing what Dean Monroe was doing had been the background frequency of her entire life. The low hum that she'd learned to treat as normal, the way you learn to treat tinnitus as normal. You stop hearing it as a sound and start hearing it as silence, which is its own kind of damage. At 5 in the morning, she got up, dressed, and went to the small kitchen, where one of the riders, a quiet, broad man who introduced himself as Pete and asked no questions, had a pot of coffee going and a plate of toast on the counter, and the particular companionable stillness of someone who understood that some people don't need to be talked to. They just need to not be alone. She sat across from him and drank her coffee and didn't say much, and he didn't say much, and that was enough. Sandra arrived at 6:30 with a pressed blazer for Haley Plain Navy. Professional. Not her size exactly, but close, and the particular energy of someone who has already been working for 2 hours and has organized the next 12 in her head and is now executing sequentially. Torres confirmed this morning, Sandra said, sitting down and opening her phone. The recordings from your mother's device are authenticated. The Helena office has filed a formal notice with the county court. The co-jurisdiction reviewer will be present at the hearing and has authority to override county-level procedural decisions. She looked up. That means if Carver tries to fast-track anything, she can stop him. Who is she? Haley asked. Judge Patricia LeMay. Family court, 15 years. She knows what these cases look like. Sandra paused. She also reviewed your mother's financial documentation last night. She called Torres at 11 p.m. to ask a clarifying question about the trust structure, which means she read it carefully enough to have questions. Haley set her coffee down. What did Dean do last night? Sandra's expression shifted slightly, not alarm, but the careful neutrality of someone deciding how much to say. His attorney made 4 separate calls to the county clerk's office between 8 and 10 p.m., she said. All logged, all documented by the clerk, who apparently found the volume of calls unusual enough to note it. They were attempting to get the hearing moved to a different venue, a procedural maneuver that would have reset the co-jurisdiction filing timeline. She folded her hands. The clerk declined. He was trying to get another day, Haley said. Yes. More time to work the angles he still had available, and time to make the evidence feel like less of a surprise in the room. Sandra looked at her directly. He doesn't know the full scope of what Torres took from the storage unit. He knows the box was opened. He knows it contained documents. But his attorney hasn't been able to get specifics because the evidence is now state-controlled and outside his access. Cole arrived at 7. He came in, poured himself a coffee, sat at the table, and looked at Haley with that level, unhurried attention. How are you? He asked. I don't know, she said. That's honest. I keep thinking about what happens if it doesn't go right today, she said. Like, what does that actually look like? What does he do if he wins? He won't. But if he did? Cole was quiet for a moment. He wasn't the kind of man who gave empty reassurance, which she'd understood within the first hour of knowing him, and that quality, that refusal to say things just to make the air in the room feel lighter was one of the things she'd come to trust about him most completely. If it didn't go right today, he said, we'd go to the next place. Torres isn't done. Helena isn't done. A county-level guardianship hearing isn't the end of the road. It's one gate on a long road, and we have documentation that exists independent of whatever happens in that room. He paused. But it is going to go right, because the evidence is real. And the evidence is in the right hands. And your mother built it so that it would survive exactly this. Haley nodded. She believed him, which was its own kind of milestone. There's something else, Cole said. I got a call this morning at 5:30 from a woman named Janet Chu. She's a journalist, not local, regional paper out of Billings. She found story through the county reporter who was in the lot yesterday. He looked at Haley. She wants to interview you. No, Haley said immediately. That's what I told her. After, she said. Maybe. If there's an after. There will be, Cole said. At 8:15, they drove to the county courthouse in a 3-car formation, Sandra's sedan, Cole's truck, and Renee in her own car, which put 5 adults on Haley's side in the parking lot before she'd taken a single step toward the building. And that arithmetic mattered more to her than any of them probably knew. Dean was already there. He was standing on the courthouse steps with his attorney, a man named Gerald Pratt, who wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent and had the contained, efficient energy of a lawyer, who charged by the quarter hour and was always aware of the clock. Russell was there too, off to the side, doing the thing he did best, which was occupy space without technically doing anything. Pierce was not present, which Sandra had predicted. His attendance would have raised questions she suspected neither he nor Dean wanted raised inside a courtroom. Dean saw Haley cross the parking lot. His expression did the thing it had done in the parking lot at the diner, performed concern, carefully calibrated. But there was something else underneath it now, something she could see because she'd seen the crack yesterday and understood what it meant. He was calculating, running numbers, trying to read what she knew from the way she walked. She kept her face even. She'd learned that from him, actually. The particular skill of not showing what you know until knowing it matters. She walked past him and up the steps without speaking, with Sandra on her left and Cole behind her and Renee slightly ahead. And Dean did not say a word. Inside the courtroom, Judge Carver sat at the bench with the settled authority of a man who had run this room for 11 years and found the familiarity comfortable. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, with reading glasses that he wore, pushed down his nose rather than on the bridge, which gave him the appearance of looking over things rather than through them. He acknowledged the co-jurisdiction reviewer, Judge LeMay, who sat to his left and slightly behind with the particular professional cordiality of a man who did not entirely welcome the presence, but understood he had no grounds to object to it. Pratt opened for Dean. He was polished and controlled and built his narrative the way architects build structures from the foundation up, one carefully placed beam at a time. He talked about Haley's history. He talked about the challenging ones following her mother's death, which was not a lie, in the way that things can be true and weaponized simultaneously. He talked about Dean's patience, Dean's consistent efforts to provide stability for a young woman who struggled with instability. He introduced a supplementary report from the clinic, the same clinic, Haley noted, the same administrator that used words like vulnerable and disorganized and at risk of poor financial decision-making. He did not mention the email Kay Briggs had provided. He hadn't seen it yet. Sandra's legal contact, a lawyer named Marcus Webb, who had driven up from Missoula and who had the kind of quiet, precise confidence that doesn't announce itself, waded through all of it without a readable expression. Haley watched him not react and found it steadying. He was not rattled. He had seen the evidence. He knew what was coming. Pratt finished. Carver looked at Webb. Counsel for the respondent? Marcus Webb stood up. Your Honor, Judge LeMay, thank you. I'd like to begin by submitting to the court's record a set of documents retrieved yesterday morning from a private storage unit belonging to the late Laura Monroe, Haley Monroe's mother, under the supervision of State Family Court. Investigator Elena Torres. Pratt was on his feet. Objection. Those documents were obtained in violation of a court-ordered injunction. The injunction named the respondents specifically, Webb said, without raising his voice or turning to look at Pratt. It did not name Investigator Torres or the State Family Court Office. As counsel is aware, the documents were retrieved by a state officer in the performance of an official inquiry. The injunction has no authority over state-level evidence collection. He paused, one beat. I'll also note that the injunction was filed at 7 a.m. yesterday. The documents were retrieved at 6:15 a.m. The timeline is in the record. Carver looked at Pratt. Pratt looked at his papers. The look was brief but visible. LeMay leaned slightly forward. I've reviewed the documentation, she said, and her voice had the quality of someone who chose words the way surgeons choose instruments. The timing is not in dispute. Proceed, Mr. Webb. Webb proceeded. He was methodical, and he was devastating in the specific, quiet way that truth deployed correctly is devastating. He placed the forged signature documents before the court and walked through each one. He noted the handwriting discrepancy that a forensic document examiner retained overnight, because Marcus Webb had also not been idle, had confirmed in a written assessment submitted as Exhibit D. He placed the bank statements before the court and walked through the $43,000 in diverted trust funds, transfer by transfer. He placed Kay Briggs's email before the court and read it aloud, slowly in its entirety. And the room did something. Rooms do when the temperature of a situation changes. It went very still. The kind of still that is not quiet, but the absence of movement. Dean's face during all of this was a study in controlled response. He was good. He was genuinely practiced, technically good at managing his presentation under pressure. And Haley, watching him from across the room, felt a complicated kind of grief that had nothing to do with sympathy, the grief of recognizing that the person taught you to read rooms and manage appearances had been teaching you the tools of his own trade, and that you had spent years not understanding that what you were learning was survival, not love. Pratt objected 4 more times. Webb answered each objection in 2 sentences or fewer. LeMay overruled 3 of them. Carver overruled the fourth himself, which told Haley something about the way the room was moving. Then Webb said, "I'd like to call the respondent to speak." Dean's attorney was on his feet instantly, and what followed was a procedural exchange that Haley couldn't fully follow, but its outcome was that Haley would speak. She stood up, and Sandra put her hand briefly on her arm, not stopping, not directing, just present, and she walked to the front of the room. She had thought about what to say. She'd gone through versions of it in the safe house room the night before, in the space between not sleeping and morning. She'd thought about making it comprehensive, about covering every year, every incident, every specific moment of control or isolation or confiscation. She'd thought about appealing to the emotion of the room, about letting them see what it had cost her. She did none of that. She spoke plainly. She described the day of the documents, the table, the pen, the wrist, the truck. She described 2 years of monitored calls and confiscated wages and a filing cabinet that held everything that made her legally real as a person. She described the storage unit and the key and what her mother had told her. She described what it felt like to be told, repeatedly, by the person who was supposed to protect her, that her own perception of her life was the problem. She did not cry. She did not perform. She spoke the way Torres had moved through the evidence methodically, specifically, without dramatizing what didn't need dramatizing, because the facts, laid flat and unembellished, were dramatic enough. When she finished, the room was quiet. Carver looked at her over his reading glasses for a long moment. Then he looked at Dean. "Mr. Monroe," he said, "do you wish to respond?" Dean stood. His attorney put a hand on his arm, a restraining gesture, identical to Pierce's in the parking lot, and Dean shook it off. Not violently. Just with the controlled impatience of a man who has decided he knows better. And that was the mistake. "Your Honor," Dean said. And his voice was the voice she'd heard her whole life, composed, reasonable. The voice of a man who has always been the most competent person in the room and never quite learned to hide that he knows it. "With respect to all of this, and I do respect the process, my daughter has been through an enormous amount of trauma, and trauma affects perception. I don't doubt that she believes what she's saying. But belief isn't the same as fact, and what this court is being asked to accept as documentation is a collection of materials that were retrieved illegally from." "The retrieval has been ruled lawful," LeMay said. Quietly. Completely. Dean paused 1/2 second. "From a private family storage unit, based on the claims of people who have known Haley for 48 hours. I've known her for 20 years. I was there when her mother died. I've been carrying this family alone since then, and I think, Mr. Monroe," LeMay's voice was not raised. It did not need to be. "The court has reviewed your financial records as they relate to the Monroe Family Trust. It has reviewed 6 signature documents that a forensic examiner has identified as inconsistent with your daughter's known handwriting. It has reviewed an email communication that suggests a financial arrangement with an independent medical evaluator whose report you submitted in support of this petition. Let that sit for a moment. I'd ask you to consider carefully what you say next." The room held its breath. Dean looked at LeMay. He looked at Carver. He looked at Webb, at Sandra, at Haley. He looked at Haley last and longest. And in his face, she saw the entire architecture of it, the years of construction, the careful maintenance, the accumulated investment, in a story that was now, in this room, in front of these people, with this evidence in the record, becoming too expensive to maintain. He sat down. Pratt leaned over and spoke quietly in his ear. Dean listened without expression. Carver removed his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is finding the language for it. "The petition for legal guardianship is denied," he said, "on the grounds that the evidence presented does not support a finding of incapacity and that significant questions have been raised regarding the petitioner's conduct that require separate investigation." He looked at Dean. "Mr. Monroe, I am referring the financial documentation submitted today to the county prosecutor's office for review. I am also noting for the record the co-jurisdiction reviewer's right to request additional state-level inquiry." He set his glasses down on the bench. "This hearing is closed. The sound in the room after that was not loud. It was the sound of people releasing breath and shifting in chairs, and one quiet sob from somewhere behind Haley that she thought might have been Kay Briggs, but didn't turn to confirm. It was the sound of a story ending and another one not yet having started, in the specific gap between them that feels like nothing but is actually everything. Dean stood. He and Pratt moved toward the door with the controlled efficiency of men who will regroup and recalculate and find the next move, because men like Dean Monroe do not stop. They redirect, and Haley understood that clearly. Today was not the last day. It was the day the ground shifted under the thing he'd built, and the thing would have to fall on its own time and by its own weight, and that process would be long and imperfect and would require her to stay standing through it. But the guardianship was denied. The trust was hers, and the walls were moving. Cole was in the corridor when she came out, standing with his arms folded and his expression, doing the thing it did, steady, present, giving nothing away until he saw her face. Then something in him released slightly, and he said, "Good, good," she said. He nodded once. That was enough. Outside the courthouse, Dean stopped on the steps. He turned back to look at Haley, and the cameras, the reporter from Billings had arrived after all, along with the county reporter whose instincts had apparently sharpened overnight, were there to record whatever happened next. What happened next was that Dean Monroe did the thing that men do when the performance is held as long as it can hold and the cost of maintaining it finally exceeds what's available. He stopped performing. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. His voice was low and controlled, but the careful warmth was entirely gone. "Everything I built, everything in that family, I built it. Your mother couldn't manage money and couldn't manage herself, and I carried all of it. And the moment I ask for something back, you do this." His jaw moved. "You're going to regret this." The cameras were rolling. Every word was on record. Pierce was not there to manage the scene. Russell was at the bottom of the steps saying nothing. Haley looked at her father. She had imagined this moment in several versions over the years, the moment when he dropped the mask, when the real thing underneath showed itself, and she had imagined herself feeling something large and cathartic, rage or relief, or the particular devastation of being right about something you'd spent years hoping you were wrong about. What she felt was quieter than any of that. It was the feeling of a question she'd been carrying since she was old enough to understand that something was wrong in her house, the question of whether she was imagining it, whether her read of things was broken, whether the version of events her father told the world was truer than the version she lived, in the question finally settling, not with anger, with the still, exhausted clarity of a thing resolved. She stepped forward, not toward him, just forward, out of the position of someone waiting to receive what he said. "Mom left that future to me," she said. "Not to the family, to me. And you didn't protect me, you imprisoned me to steal it." She said it clearly, without performance, without trembling, and every camera caught it, and Dean Monroe had nothing to say in return that would not make things worse for him, which was the truest measure of how completely the ground had shifted. He turned and walked down the steps. Russell fell in beside him. They got in the truck and drove away. The county prosecutor's office called Sandra at 2:40 that afternoon. They had reviewed the referral from Carver and were opening a formal investigation into allegations of financial fraud, document forgery, and coercive control. Dean Monroe and his attorney were being notified. An arrest was not imminent, but was, the prosecutor said carefully, within the range of outcomes being considered pending the full review. Pierce received notice of an internal affairs inquiry at 3 p.m. regarding his conduct in the parking lot and his pattern of behavior in prior interactions with Haley Monroe. He was not suspended, but was reassigned to desk duty pending the inquiry's outcome. The clinic administrator, the one whose report had been submitted in support of the guardianship petition, the one connected to the email Kay Briggs had kept for 2 years on a principle she hadn't been able to fully name until now, was informed that the county medical board had received a formal complaint regarding the independence of his evaluations. All of this happened in ordinary ways. Phone calls and paperwork and procedural notices. The machinery of accountability which moves slowly and imperfectly and with enormous friction, beginning to move. Haley sat in Sandra's office while these things unfolded and understood that none of them fixed anything immediately. Dean was not in handcuffs. Pierce was at a desk, not in a cell. The trust was legally hers, but the money was still frozen pending the auditor. She didn't have an apartment. She didn't have a phone that was really hers. She didn't have the things that make a life, the accumulated ordinary objects of existing in a place as yourself. What she had was the beginning. That evening, Renee brought her to the small apartment that the Advocacy Center maintained for transitional housing, a 2-room unit above a hardware store, clean and plainly furnished and smelling of fresh paint. There was a set of keys on the kitchen counter. 2 of them. One for the front door of the building, one for the apartment. Both hers. Renee put them on the counter and stepped back. "Paint's 3 weeks old," she said. "If you want a different color, we can do that. Furniture is what it is, but if there's something you need, it's good," Haley said. She was looking at the keys. "You choose who gets the extra," Renee said. "Anyone comes in that door, it's because you decided they could." Haley picked up the keys. They were plain and new. The kind that come from a hardware store in a paper envelope, no particular history attached to them. She had never held keys to a place that was entirely hers. She hadn't understood until this moment that she'd been waiting her whole life to know what that felt like. Cole came by that evening, briefly, with a bag of groceries that had been assembled with the specific practical care of a man who had consulted his wife. Coffee, bread, soup, a few things that kept without refrigeration, a box of tea. He set it on the counter and didn't make it into anything larger than what it was. "You settling in okay?" he asked. "I don't know how to settle in," she said. "I've never done it." "You will," he said. "Takes practice." He turned to go, and she said, "Cole." He stopped. "Thank you for stopping," she said. He turned back and looked at her for a moment with that steady, unhurried expression, and what she saw in it was not pride or satisfaction or any of the emotions that come from having done something extraordinary. What she saw was simpler and more durable than any of that. She saw a man who had done what he thought was obvious and couldn't quite understand why it required thanking. "You did the hard part," he said. "Every bit of it." He left. She heard his boots on the stairs and then the door below and then silence. She stood in the kitchen of her apartment, hers, the word still requiring effort to hold, and looked at the keys in her hand and the groceries on the counter and the window with a view of the street where ordinary life was moving past in ordinary ways. People going home from work and kids on bikes and a dog pulling a leash towards something interesting in the gutter. She had spent 20 years in a house that had every comfort and no safety. She was standing in 2 rooms above a hardware store with a borrowed blazer and a pre-pod phone and her mother's letter folded in her pocket, and she was safe. The difference between those 2 things was not comfort. It was not money or furniture or the right address. It was the lock on the door and the knowledge of who held the key. She did. That was enough to begin. The first month in the apartment above the hardware store was the hardest month of Haley Monroe's life, and she had lived through months that included her mother dying. That surprised her. She hadn't expected it. She had expected the hard part to be the parking lot, the clinic, the storage unit, the courtroom. She had expected the hard part to be her father's face when the guardianship was denied, or the moment she'd stood on those courthouse steps and said the things she'd needed to say for 20 years. She had expected that once those things were behind her, the ground would stabilize and she would find her footing, and the business of living her own life would begin in some recognizable way. What happened instead was quieter and stranger and more disorienting than any of it. The crisis ended and the adrenaline drained away, and she was left standing in 2 rooms above a hardware store with absolutely no idea how to be a person. She forgot to eat sometimes. Not from sadness, she'd known sadness her whole life and recognized its texture, but from the simple absence of a structure that had always been imposed from outside. Dean had controlled when she ate, when she slept, when she left the house, and when she came back, who she spoke to and for how long. That control had been a cage But it had also been a schedule. And schedules, it turned out, are one of the invisible scaffoldings of a daily life. And when you remove them all at once, the person inside doesn't instantly know how to build their own. She would realize at 2 in the afternoon that she hadn't eaten since the previous evening and would stand in the kitchen looking at the groceries Cole had brought and feel an unfamiliar and faintly absurd paralysis, as though choosing what to eat for lunch required a skill she hadn't been taught. She apologized constantly. For small things, for nothing, for existing in spaces she hadn't been explicitly invited into. She apologized to Sandra for asking a follow-up question. She apologized to Renee for calling on a Tuesday. She apologized to the woman at the county clerk's office for taking too long to find the right form. She caught herself doing it and stopped, and then 10 minutes later did it again, because apology had become so deeply embedded in her operating system that it ran without input. She'd spent 20 years being taught that her presence was an inconvenience. And you don't undo 20 years of teaching in a month, even a month in which every evidence of your life says the opposite. Renee had warned her. She had heard the warning and thought she understood it. She had not understood it. The third week, she called Renee at 9 in the evening and said, "I don't know how to want things, just that." No context, no preamble, because she'd run out of the energy required to construct a preamble. Renee was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a woman who had received this exact call in different forms many times before and understood exactly what it meant. "What do you want right now?" she asked. "This second. Not tomorrow, not next year. Right now." Haley thought about it. "Tea," she said. "Then make tea. That's too small." "It's exactly the right size," Renee said. "Start there." She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table and drank it and watched the street below and let the smallness of it be enough. And it was not enough to fix anything, but enough for that particular hour, which was all the enough she needed. She started therapy 2 weeks after the hearing a counselor named Dr. Miriam Wells, referred by Sandra, who had an office above a bookstore and kept a box of tissues on the table in a way that was visible but not prominent, which Haley understood was deliberate and thoughtful in a way that mattered. Miriam did not rush her. She did not build toward revelations or try to construct breakthrough moments. She asked ordinary questions and listened to the answers with the full, unrushed attention of someone who had decided that listening was a practice, not a transaction. In their third session, Haley said, "I don't trust kindness." "Tell me more," Miriam said. "When someone is kind to me, my first thought is what they want, what the price is. My dad, everything he did that looked like kindness was currency he was saving to spend later." She looked at her hands. "Cole brought groceries, and I spent 2 days trying to figure out what he was going to ask for." "What did he ask for?" "Nothing." "How did that feel?" She thought about it. "Wrong," she said. "Like waiting for the other shoe. Like something I didn't have a framework for." She paused. And then eventually, after a few days, it started to feel different. Like maybe the framework was wrong, not the kindness. Miriam nodded. "That's the work," she said. "That shift right there. That's what we're building." The legal process moved in the particular way of legal processes, necessary and slow and full of moments where nothing appeared to be happening, while things were in fact happening in offices and courtrooms and filing systems that Haley had no visibility into. The county prosecutor's investigation ran for 6 weeks. Marcus Webb kept her informed in brief, clear email updates that contained exactly the information she needed and nothing extra, which she had come to understand was a form of respect, treating her as someone capable of handling the facts without requiring them to be cushioned. In the 4th week of the investigation, a state forensic accountant completed the audit of Monroe Recovery and Towing's financial records. The total amount diverted from the Monroe Family Trust across 4 years of forged authorizations was not $43,000. It was $67,420. 3 additional signature forgeries had been found that Torres had not initially identified, all of them executed in the first year after Laura Monroe's death, when Haley had still been in enough grief and confusion that she would not have been monitoring trust correspondence. Webb called her on a Thursday afternoon to tell her the number. She sat down on the kitchen floor when he said it. Not from shock, she was past shock, she thought, but from the specific weight of it. $67,000. 4 years. Her mother saving for 22 years, and her father taking it in pieces and fixing community vehicles and building the reputation of a generous man, and Haley living in the same house without knowing, because knowing was a thing he'd made impossible. "Are you okay?" Webb asked. "Yes," she said. And she meant it, which was its own kind of landmark. Dean Monroe was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks after the hearing. Sandra texted her at 8:14 a.m. with a single sentence, "It happened." The charges were financial fraud, document forgery, coercive control, and unlawful confinement, the last charge stemming from a legal analysis of his documented pattern of controlling her movement, communications, and access to identification over a sustained period. Pratt had already filed a motion to reduce charges by the time Haley finished reading the text, which meant the process was not over, which she already knew. But he had been arrested. He had been walked through a process. The story he had told for years, the story of a stable, generous, patient father burdened by an unstable daughter, had made contact with evidence. And evidence, handled correctly, is the one thing that a story cannot absorb indefinitely. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the street for a long time after Sandra's text. She waited for something large to move inside her, the catharsis she'd been half expecting, some release of pressure that had been building for years. What came instead was smaller and stranger. Something in her shoulders dropped, just slightly. A degree of tension she hadn't known was still there, releasing. The body acknowledging what the mind had already processed. She texted Cole. He was arrested this morning. His response came back in 4 minutes. "I know. You okay?" She typed, "I think so." Then deleted it and typed, "Yes." Then sent that. His response, "All good. Coffee when you're ready." She smiled at her phone. Just briefly. The smile of someone remembering that uncomplicated kindness exists and doesn't always have a price. Pierce resigned from the sheriff's department 2 weeks into the internal affairs inquiry, before the review was complete, which told every person watching what the review was likely going to conclude. The clinic administrator was censured by the medical board, and his independent evaluation practice was suspended, pending a full review of cases he had handled in the previous 3 years. Russell Monroe, in a development that nobody had anticipated, agreed to cooperate with the prosecutor's investigation in exchange for reduced exposure on a conspiracy charge, and his cooperation produced 3 additional pieces of documentation that Webb described in an email as extremely useful, which in lawyer language meant they were very nearly the last pieces needed. The court-appointed auditor began the process of recovering the diverted funds. It would take time. It would not recover everything. Some of the money had already been absorbed into the towing company in ways that made full extraction complicated. But the bulk of it, Webb estimated $58,000, could be returned. To the trust. To her. She was in her 2nd month of therapy when Miriam asked her what she wanted to do with her life. Not in the grand, sweeping way the question is sometimes asked, not as a challenge or a directive, but in the practical, grounded way of someone who understood that Haley Monroe had never been permitted to answer it before, and that answering it would require starting from the beginning. "I want to know more about what happened to me," Haley said. "Specifically, the name for it, the structure, why it works the way it works." She paused. "And I want to understand why no one stopped it sooner. Not to be angry about it, I mean I am, a little, but that's not the main thing. I want to understand the mechanics. Because if I understand the mechanics, maybe I can—" She stopped. "Maybe you can what?" Miriam asked. "Maybe I can explain it to someone else," she said. "Someone who's in it. Someone who's being told they're crazy and needs to hear that they're not." Miriam looked at her for a long moment, not with the expression of a therapist processing clinical information, with the expression of a person seeing another person clearly. "Have you looked into social work programs?" she asked. 2 weeks later, Haley enrolled in the social work program at the community college in Byers, not the same town where Dr. Chand had documented her injuries on the night this all began. The enrollment process required identification, which she now had a new driver's license, a new social security card, a birth certificate, retrieved through the proper channels by Webb's office from the filing cabinet that had held them for 2 years. She filled out the forms herself. She chose her own classes. She wrote the short personal statement that the application required, and she wrote it honestly, without hedging, and the admissions counselor who read it called Sandra to say that she had never read an application statement like it. The first week of class was the week she also began volunteering at Renee's support center 2 afternoons a week. She started in the administrative end, answering calls, organizing documentation, helping people navigate the intake process, because those were the skills she had from being on the receiving end of it, and because Renee had said, quietly, that sometimes the most useful person in an advocacy organization is not the one with the credential, but the one who knows from the inside what the intake form feels like to fill out when you're frightened. She was good at it. Better than she expected, though Renee said she wasn't surprised. You learn to read rooms, Renee said. You learn to read people under pressure. Those are skills. They came from a hard place, but they belong to you now. It was at the support center, 3 months after the hearing, that she had the conversation she would think about for the rest of her life. A young woman named Dara, 22, with the same specific posture that Haley recognized the way you recognize a language you grew up speaking, came in on a Wednesday afternoon and sat in the intake waiting area and did not pick up the forms that the volunteer behind the desk had set in front of her. She just sat, held herself carefully in the chair the way people hold themselves when they're not sure if the space is safe enough to take up. Haley came out of the back and saw her and sat down 2 chairs over, not across from her, beside her, at the angle that says I'm here, but I'm not demanding anything, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, you don't have to fill those out today. Dara looked at her. Young face, old eyes, the specific combination that Haley had seen in her own mirror for years. You can just sit here, Haley said, if that's what you need. Dara looked back at the forms. I don't know what I need, she said. That's okay, Haley said. That's actually exactly where most people start. They sat for a few minutes without talking. Then Dara said, quietly, he says I'm unstable. Haley felt the words land with the particular weight of something she knew the exact shape of, knew from the inside, from the lived experience of hearing it said in a calm voice by someone who needed it to be believed. I know, she said. Dara looked at her. You know? I've heard those words, Haley said, from someone who needed me to believe them. She paused. I wasn't unstable, and neither are you, or you wouldn't be sitting here trying to figure out what to do next. Unstable people don't make plans. You made a plan to come here. Something shifted in Dara's face. The careful holding of it changed slightly. The way a fist changes when the hand decides not to open, but to relax 1 degree. Can I tell you something? Dara asked. Yes, Haley said. And she meant it the way Cole had meant it in the parking lot, not as permission, but as presence. As the uncomplicated offer of attention from someone who actually wanted to hear. Dara told her. Not all of it, but enough. And Haley listened without interrupting, without reassuring, without deflecting the hard parts towards something softer. She listened the way she had needed someone to listen to her in the parking lot of a diner in August, under a sun that didn't apologize for anything. When Dara finished, Haley said, thank you for telling me. It was the same sentence Cole had not said, hadn't needed to say, because his actions were the sentence, and she understood now why it mattered. Not as gratitude, as recognition, as the acknowledgement that what the other person had just done, the specific courage of telling the truth to a stranger, was worth naming. Dara picked up the forms. It was in October, 8 months of the park called the Center College Haley. There was a building in Redwater that the advocacy organization had acquired, and they wanted to talk to her about something. The building was the diner. Closed for 3 years, purchased through a combination of private donation and a grant that Sandra had been writing for 14 months. It had sat on that highway junction as the specific kind of monument that no one intends to build the place where something happened that changed the direction of things. The organization wanted to renovate it into a satellite outreach office and 24-hour safe stop for people in crisis in the county's rural areas. People who had no car, no phone, no way to reach a city-based resource. People who sat in parking lots and watched drivers go past without stopping. They wanted to know if Haley would speak at the opening ceremony. She said yes before Sandra finished the sentence. The renovation took 4 months and involved, among other contributors, the chapter Cole led 6 of them, showed up on 3 consecutive Saturdays with tools and a truck and the uncomplicated efficiency of men who were good with their hands and had decided a thing was worth doing. They fixed the plumbing, repaired the roof section that had been leaking, and rebuilt the front entrance in a way that made it accessible, which had been on the contractor's list and had been quoted at a number until Cole looked at it and said, "We can do that," in the tone of a man for whom this particular category of obstacle did not exist. The sign above the door was Haley's decision. She had thought about what to put on it for 2 months, going through versions in her head, something about safety, something about help, something about community. All of it true, none of it quite right. She settled on 4 words. The same 4 words, almost, that her mother had ended the letter with. "You will be heard here." The opening ceremony was on a Saturday in February, cold and clear, with the particular bright Montana winter light that makes everything look sharper than it is. The parking lot, the same cracked asphalt, the same highway junction filled up over the course of an hour with people Haley had not expected. Sandra came with her whole office. Marcus Webb came, which surprised her. Dr. Chand came from Byers. Kay Briggs came and stood near the edge of the lot with the specific posture of someone who had done something that cost her and was still not entirely sure how to carry the accounting of it. Torres drove down from Helena. Even the reporter from Billings came not to cover the story professionally, but because she had apparently decided somewhere along the way that this was a story she wanted to see with her own eyes. And the motorcycles came. Not 12 this time, 47, by the count someone made and shared, filling the far end of the lot in a formation that was both ordinary and striking in the way that a large group of people choosing to be somewhere always is. Cole stood beside Haley when it was time for her to speak. Not to introduce her, not to hold the microphone just beside her, the same position he'd occupied in every important moment of the last 8 months. Present, unhurried, taking up exactly the space required and not 1 inch more. She looked out at the parking lot, at all these people who had moved towards something difficult instead of past it. 8 months ago, she said, I was sitting on that concrete. She pointed to the spot, and people turned to look at it, and I had nothing. No phone, no wallet, no ID, no way to leave and no one to call, and I'd stopped believing that anyone would stop. She paused. 12 motorcycles stopped. The lot was quiet in the way that the lot had been quiet when she'd first said 2 words that changed everything, and she felt that echo, the specific resonance of a place that has absorbed something important and holds it the way old buildings hold temperature. What I want to say today is not about what was done for me, she said. It's about what happens when one person decides to stop. Just stop. Get off the highway, not because they know what to do next, or because they have the right training, or because they've read the right books. Just because there's a person sitting alone and something in them says, that's wrong, and I can do something about that, she breathed. Everything that happened after the evidence, the investigation, the hearing, all of it, it started with someone stopping. That's it. That's the whole thing. She turned to Cole. He was looking at her with that steady, even expression. What were you thinking? She asked. That first afternoon, when you walked over to me. He was quiet for a moment. The lot waited. I thought about what I would have wanted someone to do for my daughter, he said. That's all. Haley looked at him for a long moment. It's enough, she said. It turns out it's more than enough. She turned back to the crowd. This building is going to be open 24 hours a day. If you're in trouble, if someone you love, is in trouble, you can come here, and someone will be here, and they will listen. Not judge, not fix, not decide for you. Listen. She looked at the sign above the door, because that's where it starts. Not with the evidence or the lawyers or the investigation. It starts with someone deciding that another person is worth stopping for. After the ceremony, after the crowd thinned and the coffee ran out and the afternoon light went long and thin across the parking lot, Cole stayed. He did what he'd done on that first day. He stood near Haley without crowding her, looking out at the highway, letting the silence exist without treating it as a problem. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Being back here." She looked at the spot where she'd sat. The cracked concrete, the wall of the building, now freshly painted, with a new door that opened from both sides. "Different," she said, "like standing in a place after the stories changed. Same ground, different weight." She paused. "I used to think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped, if you just kept going." "Somebody else would have, eventually," he said. "Maybe," she said. "But you were the one who did." She looked at him. "That matters. The specific person who stops, that matters." He nodded slowly. "Cole." She said his name with the deliberateness of someone who has been choosing words carefully for a long time and means for this one to land exactly where she's putting it. "You asked me a question in this parking lot 8 months ago, and I want you to know that question was the first time, and as long as I can remember, that I told the complete truth to another person. Not because I calculated that it was safe, because something about the way you asked it made me believe that you actually wanted to know." He looked at her. "I thought telling the truth would destroy everything," she said. "I didn't know it would be the first thing that set me free." Something moved across his face, not sentiment, not pride, but the quiet expression of a man who has carried a difficult world for a long time and recognizes, in moments like this one, why it's been worth carrying. "You did that," he said. "I just asked." The last thing that happened that day happened at 4:17 in the afternoon, 20 minutes after Cole had ridden out with the other bikes. One by one, the sound of the engines fading south the same way it had faded in that original morning when 12 riders had arrived and then left and then arrived again and again and again until the arriving became a different kind of presence, not intervention but community, which is slower and less dramatic and infinitely more durable. A car pulled into the new Outreach Center's parking lot. An older model, the front passenger window replaced with plastic sheeting. It parked and the door opened, and a woman got out, maybe 40, moving with a particular careful economy of someone managing pain. And she stood for a moment looking at the building. She looked at the sign. She looked at the door. She looked at Haley, who was the only person left in the lot, pulling her jacket tighter against the February cold, about to lock up. "Is this the place?" the woman asked. "Where they listen." Haley looked at her. At the way she was standing, the same held careful posture, the same old eyes in a tired face, the same specific quality of a person who has been waiting a long time to find out whether asking for help will make things better or worse. "Yes," Haley said. "Come in." She held the door open. The woman walked through it, and the story of Haley Monroe, the girl who had sat alone on cracked concrete with nothing but a brass key and 2 words of truth, who had spent 20 years being told that her voice wasn't worth hearing, who had found out in the space of 48 hours what one person choosing to stop could set in motion. Her story did not end in a courtroom or a headline or a moment of triumph on courthouse steps. It ended in a doorway, with a door held open, with a frightened woman walking through it into warmth and light, and the simple, radical, world-altering act of being heard. That was the whole of it. That was every bit of what mattered. One person stops. One person tells the truth. One door opens. And the chain of courage that builds from that quiet, ordinary, unstoppable goes farther than anyone standing at the beginning could ever see.